But it's very appropriate, I think, that as we move from Andrew and Ollie, who've just both talked to us about creative interaction with literary text, that we have for our last speaker, Daljit Nagra, who used to be an English teacher, I believe, Daljit, in
That's
your
right, a long time ago.
um, and is now a very well-known poet on the Faber and Faber list. And I'm delighted that Daljit's been able to join us and has agreed to give us a reading and to take some questions at the end about his poetry. Many of you will know him as a poet whose work is on both the GCSE and the A-level specifications, but never mind that. Just a fabulous poet in his own right. So Daljit, thank you very much for joining us. And I will hand over to you with no further delay.
Great. Hopefully my sound is clear enough. I'm coming across clearly. Great.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
So I thought I'd read maybe a poem each from my 4 collections. I can do things like this, can't I, on the screen? It's great. So I loosely sort of themed my talk about nation and myth. Hopefully they'll come through in each of my readings here, but of poems. So I'll start with my Ramayana, which is my 3rd collection, as it were, the Ramayana, the Indian epic. And I was very keen to do a version of this because there's no one agreed version of the story, and it exists in many different versions around India, Malaysia, Philippines, Burma, Thailand. And I sort of looked at many different translations. I was thinking of the graphic novel tradition, the kind of the paintings, and as much as I could to infuse into the language my version. And I'm starting to think of the Ramayana as really as an English text now, because children are aware of Diwali, Festival of Lights. So I want to kind of keep faithful to the kind of the basic storyline. So in this prologue that's sort of made up, I'll just read this to give you a sense of the language I was after. The gods are complaining to Vishnu, the main god in my version, about Ravana, this supposed demon. So we'll get the backstory of Ravana. So this is an extract from prologue. It's called Get Ravana. Lord of the cosmos, Vishnu was brought back to heaven from his stellar meditation by many gods now stooped at his feet. Said one, semi-stooped in the saffron light, O Lord, whilst we in 1,000-day prayers for peace are bent, Ravana is bish-boshing our kingdoms. No wonder the gods were gurgling with collywobbles. Ravana was toasting their earthly and galactic worlds. But who was this scallywag, this Gunda? Lord of the cosmos, Vishnu flashed umpteen visions to the gods that showed Ravana's path to glory. In the first flashback, Vishnu displayed Ravana being born with 10 heads and 10 pairs of arms. Then he showed Ravana, the teenager, on the hillock, meditating for so many non-stop years that smoke was issuing from his head and dulling the heavens. No surprise, in Vishnu's next vision, Ravana was losing his mind and was holding a blade to cut off his own 10 heads. Vishnu from on high stopped him by asking what he is wanting. Ravana boomed back, Am I not a worthy king of the universe, Lord? Vishnu must have hoped Ravana would become pure Shanti, a bit like himself. Yet soon as Vishnu's divine engine touched across each Ravana atom in a somewhat unparalleled way, Ravana went bonkers. His 10 heads, his 10 sets of arm, trapezoid, rump, knuckle and whatnot jutted tsunami volcanically into a hardcore fierce flaring up. His every milli-inch was muscling, pinnacling with indestructibilityness. Okay, I'll stop that bit there, thank you. And I guess I partly wrote that version to help me understand my kind of cultural heritage, to understand where the values of my own background come from, because my parents were very, very strict Indians. I guess they became more Indian by coming here as migrants in the late 50s. They worked in factories and then they had a shop in Sheffield. But over time, they became much more Punjabi Indian. They became kind of almost nationalistic in many ways, whilst not living in India. After they retired, they spend part of their time in India and part of the time here now. and almost gone to a point where they hardly ever speak English. They almost see it as a foreign language, having lived here 50 years. So I kind of want to understand some of their values, but also see some of the richer elements of the Indian heritage for myself, because my parents are uneducated and they have these kind of very black and white views on quite a lot of issues. Okay, I'll read one from my my first collection, and as Andrew mentioned, I've got a poem in the in GCSE and A-level, so I'll read the one from my the A-level anthology. So it's my Look We Have Coming to Dover collection, which this is part of Faber's 10 Books of the Century. So they did a special series. So this represents the noughties, and my book came out in 2007. So I'll read Look We Have Coming to Dover, my particular poem about migrants coming to Britain. And I wrote this sort of around about 2003-04. Particularly that wave of migrants coming during the time of Tony Blair. And I was partly thinking of that wave of migration as well as my own parents' wave of migration, trying to connect the two. And I imagine, and I've kind of messed up the English here, and I'm trying to almost do it as seafarer journeys, the way the kind of British going abroad, here, migrants coming in. And I guess I've got things like tourists are proud on the cruiser, so I mean PROW. We've got loads of kind of things like that. Hopefully some of them will come across. But it's basically about migrants coming to Britain whilst we go, holiday in Costa France. And then the rest of it is really just about their hopes of, the migrants' hopes of surviving here. And I've got this shape to the poem. I might show that, sort of like trying to get that Dover beach effect. I'll read it. So it's called Look We Have Coming to Dover. Stowed in the sea to invade the alfresco lash of a diesel breeze, ratcheting speed into the tide, brunt with gobfuls of surf, phlegmed by cushy come-and-go tourists, proud on the cruisers, lauding the ministered waves. Seagull and shoal life, vexing their blarneys upon our huddled camouflage, past the vast crumble of scummed cliffs, scrumming on mulch, as thunder and bladders, yobbish rain and wind on our escape, hutched in a Bedford van. Seasons or years we reap inland, unclocked by the national eye, or stabs in the back, teamed for breathing sweeps of grass through the whistling asthma of parks, burdened, ennobled, polling sparks across pylon and pylon. Swarms of us, grafting in the black, within shot of the moon's spotlight, banking on the miracle of sun to span its rainbow, passport us to life. Only then can it be human to hoik ourselves barefaced for the clear. Imagine my love and I, and our sundry others, blared in the cache of our beeswaxed cars, our crash clothes. Free. We raise our charged glasses over unparasoled tables east, babbling our lingos, flecked by the chalk of Britannia. Okay, admittedly, that's a very difficult poem. And I feel sorry for the A-level students who have to study that. It's a very challenging poem. So I'll read a couple more pieces. So I'll read one from my latest collection, British Museum. And I've got a very long poem about the British Museum. I'm thinking about soft power, British soft power, and around the world, and how poetry can help us understand, and art can help us understand global politics. And I've got another very long one about the BBC. So I'll read that, because I was poet in residence for the BBC for a couple of years. And I present a programme every week called Poetry Extra every Sunday. It's my plug for Radio 4 Extra. So I'm in the BBC quite a bit. So this is my third section. So I was partly thinking about what is a British voice, and are we going to lose our voice through restrictions and things like that. And in this final section, I was partly thinking about the BBC World Service. It's like a floor in the middle of the building, and it's completely full of brown faces, and then above and below, they're just all these white middle-class faces. So I find that BBC, it's like a little kind of cake with this chocolate there in the middle there. So I refer to that floor in particular. And I was partly writing about the piazza. I don't know if you've been down the BBC, And the piazza is quite often quite lively. They have bands playing there, you know, for various TV programs or radio channels. So I was thinking the hubbub there. And I refer, I'm sorry, to Piers Plowman, William Langland. Some of you may have read that, a Middle English poem. So sorry about that. It says part 3. There is a ship of man that becomes a ship of the world in Piers Plowman. There, the waters are wealth through which a vessel rides. The fortune of a vessel lies within the rise and fall of the waves. Our house, to the BBC, our house is a vessel that's geared to sift the waves, the fortune, and so broadcasts the worldly profit and loss. I watch a portion of this strain from the building's upper floor, United Nations of tongues. One desk is all Bogota. Another is labelled Western Central Asia on a deck that never sleeps. From their channels, they present an unvarnished version of home to home. Does our service prove we're preserved in order to signpost each dodgy globocop, each demagogue? To write the Bobby's report, although the Bobby's under mask and is filling his boots? What of our own estate? How do we build a new being? Could we update our failed and mural customs? Become the ploughman who ascends the hill of battles with ideals? Could we shed bias armed with knowledge, conscience, to fight for a steadfast voice? And accept that to stay at sea is to stay at home, and not bully for John Bull or the tea cake vistas of Betjeman? Straddle the centre and not become anodyne, to serve and be served by our house. Inside and out along the piazza, our house is awash with the sounds of our island, an autopilot of accord and retort. No longer replenished by ourselves as we diminish or implode, are we doomed to look back at the dream that fell from the airwaves, this craft of the national mind, this tower of truth, this Roman forum, this thoroughfare of modern Britain, this gilded world, this happy field of people. Okay, I've got I think time for one more. So I'll read again another extract from another very long poem from my second collection, which has got a long, silly title, so I won't mention it now. And it's now this poem's included in the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and it's quite a long one. So I'm very pleased it's in there, and it's kind of full of references and allusions. And it's really just about thinking about the Globe Theatre, and from when it was first built to now, the rebuilding. And in that time, there was a rise and fall of the British Empire. So I write quite a lot about that and think about Shakespeare. I imagine I'm at the Globe watching a Shakespeare tragedy. I don't specify which one. And I'm going to read the final 3 short sections. So it's called A Black History of the English-Speaking Peoples. So I'll read out section 3. Here I'm just thinking about Shakespeare and the original Globe. So 3. The heyday Globe incited brave new verse modelled on the past, where time's frictions courted Shakespeare's corruptions for tongue's mastery of the pageant subject. Perhaps the Globe should be my muse. I'm happy digging for my England's good garden to bear again. My garden's only a state of mind, where it's easy aligning myself with a turncoat T.E. Lawrence and a half-naked fakir, and always the groundling. Perhaps to aid the succession of this language of the world, for the poet reading the roots, for the debate in ourselves, now we're bound to the wheels of global power, we should tend the manorial slime, that legacy offending the outcasts who fringe our circles. So 4, Kurtz as in Heart of Darkness, Kurtz here. 4, who believes a bleached yarn? Would we openly admit the Livingston spirit turned curts. Our flag is a union of black and blue, flapping in the anthems of haunted rain. Coming clean would surely give us greater distance than this king at the Globe, whose head seems cluttered with golden age bumps, whose suffering ends him agog at the stars. And the final section, I refer to Colonel Lawrence, who said, you know, every man should die at his post rather than surrender. This kind of heroic figure in the 19th century, 18th century. So, final part of 5. I applaud and stroll toward Westminster. Yet softly tonight, the waters of Britannia bobble with flotillas of tea and white gold cotton and sugar and the sweetness and light bloodlettings and ultimately red-faced Suez. And how swiftly the tide removes from the scene the bagpipe clamouring garrisons with the field-wide scarlet soldiery and the martyr's cry, every man die at his post. Till what's ahead are the upbeat lovers who gaze from the London eye at multinationals lying along the sanitised Thames. Okay, we're going to stop there, Andrew. If there's time for any questions, what do you think? A few minutes for questions, I think, or comments.
Thank you. I've just been unmuted. I don't have the power, you see, to mute or unmute today. So there we go.
I'm just messing with you.
We have one question already for you, Daljit. Thank you very much. You know, lovely to hear those read in your own voice, and to hear from the range of the work that you've done. So thank you for that. But we've had a question here from Ollie, who said, could you tell us a little bit about the Poet in Residence BBC position, and your feelings about the public role of poetry, literature, the arts more generally?
Yeah, it's a big area, but my kind of, I guess my role as Poet in Residence, I was asked in 2015, contacted by someone from the BBC if I'd be a Poet in Residence. So it was the first one, and for a couple of years, up to 2017. And in that time, I got to go on various programmes and talk about whatever I wanted. I just wanted to talk about poetry, to big up poetry. And I presented a little series I devised called Blast about contemporary poetry scene. And also started this Poetry Extra, where we repeat old poetry programmes on a weekly basis, every week throughout the year. And yeah, I think the role of public poetry is a complicated one, isn't it? Because I think, in a sense, poetry is written in private. It's a kind of conversation in the head with the self. All those sort of ideas we think of poetry. And then sort of public poetry is very public facing. It's sort of, it probably needs to give up some of its complexity and aim at a kind of immediacy. So it loses the kind of complexity and subtlety of art. So it's a different kind of art, I would say, to this kind of page poetry, but it's still a kind of valid, important art form. I think you'd have to kind of simplify the poem. It's almost closer to performance poetry in some way, or spoken word poetry, I think, where everybody's going to get the message and everybody understands what's being said at the same time. So I think there's a really important place for that. And we see it in kind of key celebrations, key events. Usually a performance poet's invited to write a poem that everyone can connect with, and connect with their particular kind of own rhythms and own kind of idioms. So I see that as valid. I mean, I wouldn't get all kind of elitist about it and say that's an inferior form of poetry. That's a kind of poetry written very quickly for an immediate purpose, and written in a kind of accessible form. So I think that style is really important as well. And you're probably not going to read, kind of, I don't know, a Shelley or Keats poem at these sort of events. It might be slightly too difficult and too demanding. So I appreciate those forms.
Thank you. Just on the subject of that, you were talking about the broadcasting. We've had a question from Sarah saying, asking about the timings for the BBC programmes that you do. Do you know?
It's Sunday at 4:30. Oh, sorry, 5. I'm forgetting now. Sunday at 5.
Sunday at 5, and that's on Radio 4 Extra, is it?
Yeah, it's been going for a few years, and it will hopefully go on for a few years.
Okay, excellent.
So programmes.
I'm going to work on an observation that somebody made here and turn this into a question. Katie says, thank you for saying how difficult Look We Have Coming to Dover is. She's about to start teaching it. So I guess there's a kind of, you know, is there a way in there?
Into the poem, is there a way?
Yes, that you would give to anybody teaching the poem.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a story, a very simple story on the surface, that people are arriving and they're hoping to become permanent, have a passport. So there's a simple story, and then there's a story of the language. This kind of great big clash and collision of high language, low language, a mixture. You know, they've got Blarneys and Irish slang words. So hopefully the language capturing the sensibility of otherness, and also just probably appreciating Britishness, the British language, the way it goes abroad and picks up words. And in a way, Britain has been really accepting of people from other countries historically. I know it's partly, you know, there's an empire legacy, but also we have been very welcoming, and there's a need to celebrate that and see ourselves at our best. So hopefully the poem has elements of that, I think. And I sort of leave it open, hopefully, for students to decide whether it's a positive experience these people are having or a negative. And whether you want to view this as a horrific experience, these people coming into our country. And in some sense, I use the language of of the racists, these swarms of us. And I want to play with the reader. What do you make of that? Are you offended by that? That I should call us, we call ourselves swarms, that we feel your burden? Or how do you play with that? So hopefully it's a poem of play and sort of humour. I think
so that chimes with a lot of the things that people said already. I'm reminded from what from that idea of the difficulty of the poem of TS Eliot, who said, I believe I'm right in saying that some of his favourite poetry was poetry he didn't understand the first time he read it, and he then goes on to say that he still thinks that it's some poetry that some of that is poetry he still doesn't understand, and he takes the idea that understanding is not necessarily something that we should be striving for. That what we should be looking for is the pleasure of the experience, and perhaps how we can capture the pleasure of the experience as part of you know what we're doing when we engage with literature. That balance between pleasure and instruction that we talked about.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think Geoffrey Hill would agree with you there, wouldn't he? Geoffrey Hill, who said only toilets should be accessible, which is a horrible thing to say, because I think I've got quite a few accessible poems, but there's a valid point there, isn't there? Some poems need to be challenging and just work at a kind of emotional mood level first.
So thank you. Another question is this. As English teachers, we spend a lot of time analysing poetry. The question that follows that is, how do you think we could encourage more of our students to become involved in creating poetry?
Oh, I think the best, I mean, I teach, obviously, as you know, Andrew, creative writing. I teach a lot of poetry at university. My kind of emphasis always to throw emphasis on writing themselves, students to write themselves, not to see it as this thing to be worshipped and admired, and almost see it as a process, that somebody had an idea in their head, then they wrote it and they rewrote it, and then hopefully it's a kind of conversation. You know, we're having this, as Ollie mentioned in his previous talk, you know, we're standing shoulders giants, we're hearing these poems, and then we in turn are we're creating this kind of extended conversation. So I would always encourage a fluid response to a poem. Here's something somebody's written, and this is as far as they could get with it, that's the best they could get. Now you develop your own poem in exchange with that. I mean, a lot of my poems come through dialogue with other poems, I think. So they don't really just come out of nowhere. It's usually, or a poem's inspired me to write a poem. So I hope that my poems might inspire other people to write poems. So my Dover Beach poem, I think of looking at migrants around, writing about their experience, or us as migrants on Earth and our short time we're here, and thinking about travel. The poem's partly about travelling and having the experiences that these migrants having. You know? So write your own holiday poem, as it were. So there's lots of kind of ways to flip every poem you ever read, or any novel or short story you read, I think. So always think of the creative act.
Thank you. We've got another question here, which is to do with the question is this. I'm going to again work with the question here. It says how do we stop students looking for or even using the phrase hidden meanings? There's one question, and then my follow-up question to that is, what's the hidden meaning of Daljit Nagra?
I don't think there is. There's no hidden meaning, is there? There are layers and layers and layers, potentially, which are our own layers that we find in something. And really, there's no hidden meanings. The hidden meaning we're finding is what we're finding out about ourselves, really. So I think students should be seeing that as a kind of personal investigation, or discover something about myself because I saw this in this poem. Why do I see this? Why was I fascinated by that idea in particular? How does it relate to me? In that psychological sense. My hidden layers, Andrew, just simply world peace. It'd be lovely to see people getting on, and for us to be working in a global way as far as possible, to be connected as far as possible in a positive way. So it's a very simple message. I think my poetry is trying to communicate in its own kind of convoluted ways.
One thing I'd like to ask you, and I think would be interesting for people to hear about, is one of the things that I've been struck by reading through your work is how often you adopt a voice.
Mm.
And I wonder how you go about trying to create a particular voice for a persona in your poem, or a character in perhaps the longer narrative poems. How do you set about hearing that voice and then using it?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because you don't know how that happens. I think part of it is having this habit of always wanting to think of turning things into poems. And for me, it was I was really interested in Shakespeare plays and complex characters. If you took a character's a monologue piece out, it's so much richer because it's got a wider context. And so voices to me felt important, that if I could build a context into them, a dramatic scenario, they become really rich and complex. So it was just a way of telling the story. And I feel more natural with that, I think. Telling stories of characters, and they partly come from memory, just hearing people when you're younger, and you look to exaggerate that. What was it? It's Kafka's line, isn't it? About he exaggerates situations to get to the truth. He exaggerates situations to get clarity, which is weird when you think of Kafka, but almost with those sort of characters you create, slightly comic characters, slightly inflated, slightly dramatic, as a way of capturing some sort of universal truth or complexity about East and West politics. So it's partly memory, partly what you're just always listening to with the habit, the inclination to turn that into a poem, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for the word indestructibilityness, by the way. I saw a post from David saying he now had a small child running around the house shouting indestructibilityness.
Yeah, my son was listening. He really enjoyed that, pinnacling with indestructibilityness. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
So there we go. We'll be living with the consequences of that for the rest of the day.